You are about to learn the top 12 in our wide receiver rankings, players that Jared and I are targeting in our drafts right now, and some guys that we're fading. Plus, you're going to find out a key wide receiver that Jared and I do not agree on. Ready to find out who that player is, who's on which side, and what it means for the rest of his team? An all-new Draft Sharks podcast starts right now. Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to talk wide receiver rankings. We will be revealing the top three tiers of our half PPR rankings for the position at DraftSharks.com. We're also going to talk some of our favorite targets in drafts right now, some wide receivers that we're personally fading. And you might have noticed that we're coming at you a day later than usual with this episode. That's because my pal Jared here took some, well-deserved time off around the weekend. Jared, what'd you do with that extra time?
Yeah, I was down outside of Pittsburgh at the U.S. Open. As you can tell, I got sunburnt and I got drenched in rain in the span of like 4 hours on Sunday. So it was a grind out there, but it was fun, beautiful course. And Matt, I know you have no idea, but it was an unbelievable finish to the tournament.
I did actually see the final putt. What was did you have any particular favorite moments that you saw personally?
Yeah, so we were posted up behind 16 green where you could also see the tee box on 17, and 17 is a short drivable par 4. And that's the hole where JJ Spawn, the eventual winner, hit really the shot. The putt is going to go down as like the famous shot of the tournament, but he only needed to two putt that to win. So it was just kind of a bonus and it went in. His drive on 17 was what won him the tournament. And I had an excellent view of that. So I ended up being fortunate to be watching from where we were on Sunday.
Nice. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I think it's a little weird personally that you drove like 5 hours to watch golf and to experience what sounds like Rochester weather.
Yes. Yep. I loved it every second.
Well, I'm glad you had fun. Of course, my eye is a little bit more open. I can see the wide receiver rankings a little better than I could see the running back rankings. So we'll hope that we keep trending in the right direction. But people didn't come for updates on my eye. They came for wide receiver rankings, and that's what we're going to get to. Like I said, we're focused on the half PPR wide receiver rankings. You can find them on DraftSharks.com right now, along with the other, basic scoring formats. Of course, if you sync your league, then you're going to get rankings that are actually custom fit to your exact format, including automatically generated tiers that really show you where the separation is between players, because two guys next to each other, often close together, not always close together. These rankings are also not based simply on our baseline projections. They also incorporate floor projections, ceiling projections, consensus projections, and the resulting 3D projection from all of those considerations, then combine with cross-positional calculations. That delivers the 3D value, and that is what does sort these players into the rankings we're going to get to. Really, it's the best valuation system that you're going to find because it's not straight rankings. It is all of those considerations combined together. And like I said, automatically generated tiers specific to the format. And we're going to go by tier in this show, revealing our top 12 at wide receiver. Tier 1, Jared, we've got Ja'Marr Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson. Makes sense. I mean, Chase is probably less safe among those three than the other two in terms of target share, but he's also got the best quarterback among the three, and he's in the league's most pass-friendly offense.
Yeah, you're going to see Ja'Marr Chase go off the board 1 overall more often than not. He is our top-ranked player, both in full PPR and half PPR. If you're playing non-PPR, a couple of running backs bump ahead of him, I believe, but not much needs to be said about Ja'Marr Chase. He scored 2.5 more half PPR points per game than any other wide receiver last year. It was the 15th most points per game by a receiver in NFL history. So even if the volume drops off a little, the efficiency drops off a little, he's still a good bet to lead the position in fantasy points.
Any notes on the other two, or should we move on to the next tier?
Consensus ADP has Jefferson ahead of Lamb. We have Lamb at 2, Jefferson at 3. So that's a stance. I've taken a lot of CeeDee Lamb in early drafts so far. Basically, anytime I have a pick in the middle of the first round, he's often the top guy in my draft wardroom when I'm on the clock. Obviously, coming off a disappointing season, for him, he finished wide receiver 11, so it wasn't a disaster, but not kind of where you picked him, how you picked him to produce. But without his quarterback for the second half of the season, Dak Prescott went down in week 9. Lamb also played through a shoulder injury for a lot of the second half of the season. Just go back to 2023, though, and Lamb led all wide receivers in half PPR points. And as we talked about in the Coaching Changes podcast in particular, we're expecting the Cowboys to be a pass-heavy offense under Brian Schottenheimer. They were last year when Dak Prescott was healthy. They were actually the pass-heaviest offense in the NFL. So even with the arrival of George Pickens, and that did ding our projected target share for CeeDee Lamb. He still stayed wide receiver 2 because we have Dallas throwing the ball so much.
Yeah, and I expect that to be worse news for the target shares of everybody else on the team, more so than CeeDee Lamb. I do prefer CeeDee Lamb slightly ahead of Justin Jefferson if I'm making one decision at number 2. If I'm drafting for volume, I'm making sure to hit on all those guys in that range of draft. Obviously, all 3 of them have the upside to lead the position in scoring. I think that the guy at the top of tier 2 also does. That's Puka Nacua, officially at number 4. If you're looking at PPR, he actually jumps into tier 1, still number 4, but with those top 3 wide receivers in the same tier. I think he's also probably the best wide receiver value in round 1 right now. Number 1 wide receiver last year in success per route, according to Matt Harmon's reception perception. And Nakua's 23.5% in that particular category is 5.3 percentage points ahead of number 2, Chris Godwin. If you take that same gap and look down past Godwin, the next 13 receivers on the list all fit within that range. So that's how far Nacua was ahead of everybody else. In that same metric, Jamar Chase was 8th. Justin Jefferson 14th, CeeDee Lamb outside the top 15. So just adds some context to how good Nacua was when he was on the field last year. Dealt with injuries, which cut into his overall scoring, but remained terrific when he was playing. And just to round out that tier, we've got Nico Collins at 5, Malik Neighbors at 6, Brian Thomas Jr. at 7. What do you got to focus on within tier 2?
Yeah, Puka was a monster last year. Kind of got overshadowed by the fact that he missed a handful of games and was also, he left one early and also got ejected from another. So he played 9 full games. He averaged 10.9 targets per game on a 35.6% target share in those 9 games. I do think that Devontae Adams is an upgrade over Cooper Kupp and is probably going to take more target share than Kupp did last season. But man, Puka could lose 3 percentage points on his target share and still, be right there with another guy in this tier, Malik Neighbors, as, probably the league leaders in target share. So I love Puka. He often, I think as you alluded to, Matt, he often gets to the back half, even the back, few picks of round 1. I think he's an excellent pick there. And then I want to highlight Malik Neighbors here too, who I think has the potential this season to jump into that tier 1 even, because I think the target share is going to be there. Last year, led the NFL in target share, 32.2%, led the NFL in first read target share. That's according to Fantasy Points, 42.8% first read target share. This offense was designing plays to get Malik Neighbors the ball. And then, Russell Wilson, he is what he is at this point of his career. He's not, prime Russell Wilson anymore, but he's a big upgrade over what they had for the majority of last season. And then if he's not, there's Jameis Winston, there's Jackson Dart. So Malik Neighbors is a virtual lock, I think, to get better quarterback play this season. And the target competition is the same. The Giants did not add anything. So I think Neighbors could again see a 30+% target share this season.
Yeah, I think that Malik Neighbors, first of all, Malik Neighbors jumps over Nico Collins if we're looking at PPR instead of half PPR. I think his ceiling reaches all the way to number 1 at the position. I think he's one of those guys that has the upside to lead the position in scoring. We're going to have to monitor his toe injury through the summer. He's currently sitting out of workouts because of that. It doesn't sound like it's serious, but, obviously that's the kind of thing that we have to keep an eye on to make sure he's okay for the season. But I mean, an amazing rookie year, especially when you consider how bad the quarterback play was. Any upgrade on the QB front should only add to that. I love the upside. Brian Thomas Jr., I'm mildly worried about his target outlook relative to this ranking and his first round ADP. I think you probably have to decide whether you're in favor of Brian Thomas Jr. or Travis Hunter in drafts. I don't think, if you're drafting for volume, then you can get shares of both. But I think that just kind of conceptually, you have to decide, is Brian Thomas Jr. going to be the stud and leader this year? Or did they trade up to 2 to draft Travis Hunter because they think he's special? And that's going to cut into Brian Thomas Jr.'s target share at least a bit.
Yeah, if Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter pay off their current ADPs, then Trevor Lawrence is a total smash, and he's a top 10 fantasy quarterback, maybe even higher than that. So I lean towards Thomas at this point. Still waiting to see what Jacksonville's plans for Hunter are. But I am with you, Matt. I think Thomas has the lowest floor among these guys we've talked about so far, because he could end up with a target share, 23, 24% if Travis Hunter is kind of the 1B this season. The thing with Thomas, though, is he was just so damn good last year. I mean, 2.45 yards per route run. That was 6th among 84 qualifying wide receivers in the league and 1st among 11 qualifying rookie wide receivers. We know how good this rookie wide receiver class was last year, and Thomas was the best in terms of yards per route. I don't see him busting, because I think he's so good. He could disappoint if Travis Hunter, kind of does more than we're expecting at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I don't expect a bust. I think there's room for him to potentially disappoint. And, sometimes that's enough. If you're making a single choice, I'm not on Brian Thomas Jr. over Malik Neighbors or over Nico Collins, and maybe a guy that's about to come up behind him. The one other question with the Jags, of course, is how the run pass distribution looks under Liam Cohen. This team is much better built to throw the ball than to run the ball right now. I know that we all love Bashal Tootin around here, but he's a 4th round pick, and they moved up to number 2 to get Travis Hunter. So they should be throwing the ball plenty. I'm not using that as a ding against Brian Thomas Jr. Tier 3, A.J. Brown leads it off. Then Amon-Ra St. Brown behind him, Drake London, T. Higgins, and Tyreek Hill to round out the top 12. Jared, for me, A.J. Brown is kind of the standout here, and we'll talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown in a minute, but I think he's slightly undervalued in where he's going. Wide receiver 10 in underdog ADP. Like I said, wide receiver 8 in our half PPR rankings. Those differences make more of a difference higher in the draft. He's going 17th overall, though, nearly middle of round 2. That's a guy who was the end of round 1 last year. And I don't think that there's anything about A.J. Brown's 2024 that should knock him down from where he was last year. PPR points per game, I know underdog's half PPR, but looking at PPR points per game, since he got to Philly, 17.7 per game that first year, 17.2 the second year, 16.7 last year, but 10th among wide receivers in PPR points per game over that whole span, 6th in non-PPR. So, the less you count receptions, certainly the better A.J. Brown is. But at the very least, he retains that extremely high week-to-week ceiling that means even more at best ball time than it does in lineup setting. And he led all wide receivers in air yard share last year. So, maybe there's a bit of room for change in the target share, but his target share remains strong. His air yard share remains strong. His quarterback is still the same dude, and he's still a talented guy. I think he's mildly underrated right now.
Yeah, I'm with you, which is funny because I feel like we've been below market on A.J. Brown for most of his career, really. But yeah, I'm in on him this year at cost, anywhere at the very end of round 1, or I think in round 2, he's an awesome pick. A.J. Brown finished wide receiver 11 and half PPR points per game last year, so one spot below where he's being drafted now, despite the Eagles ranking dead last in pass attempts by a wide margin. They actually became just the 8th team over the last 10 seasons to throw fewer than 27 passes per game. So as we've talked about in other podcasts, just a good bet, whether it's the defense regressing a bit, them just trailing in more games, Saquon Barkley missing time with injury. I just think the Eagles are a really strong bet to throw more this season, probably significantly more. And that was the only problem for A.J. Brown last year. He had a 31.4% target share in his healthy games. That was a top 5 mark in the NFL. He also set career highs last year in yards per route run, PFF receiving grade, ESPN receiver score. So he was still, no decline in his game, still one of the best, most efficient wide receivers in the NFL. If he does what he did last year and just gets like 2-3 more passes per game from the Eagles, like he has a chance to finish as a top 5 receiver.
Yeah, this team could go 50% run, and that would be a 6 percentage point rise in pass rate versus last year. Amon-Ra St. Brown behind him is the guy that I'm fading in this round. And I mean, it's not totally comfy to say that, but I honestly don't feel that uncomfortable in saying it. He's wide receiver 6 in underdog ADP, which I think is a little bit surprising considering we're talking half PPR, which already dings St. Brown's both upside and floor a little bit. We saw some change in his usage last year. St. Brown tied for 2nd in expected half PPR points per game in 2023. He ranked just 12th among receivers in that category last year, 5th among wideouts in target share in 2023, 10th last year. So just those slight declines in those areas, that makes me not want to target Amon-Ra St. Brown this year when he's still going in round 1. And with the same challenges to him, plus the challenge of Ben Johnson leaving the OC post. So there's just at least the question of exactly what does the offense look like, and can it be as successful as it was over the past 3 years?
Yeah, St. Brown was just 12th among receivers in expected half PPR points per game. So, 6 spots lower than he's being picked right now. As you said, Matt, his target share went from 28.4% in 2023 to 25.6% last year. And if you just look at the Lions' final 9 games, or St. Brown's final 9 games with Jamison Williams, this includes the playoffs, In those games, his target share dipped another percentage point to 24.6%. That's a scary number for a first-round wide receiver on a run-leaning offense. All this Jameson Williams buzz about an increased role for him, that's either going to have to not be true for St. Brown to pay off this price tag, or he's just going to have to be even more efficient than he's been the past couple of years. And that's going to be really tough, especially with the departure of Ben Johnson.
And by the way, all of this happened in kind of a mildly disappointing season for Sam Laporta last year, where the Lions kind of said, we'd like to get him the ball more, and we'll see if his target share changes this year. But any uptick there is going to at least challenge the target share further for Amon-Ra St. Brown. So when we're talking about somebody that's still in round one, that's the guy that I'm really fading the most among the wideouts that we're talking about here. Behind Amon-Ra St. Brown, like I said, Drake London, T. Higgins, I honestly have no strong feelings about those guys at all. I'm fine where they're going. I'm not specifically targeting them in the range where they're going. Tyreek Hill is the interesting one. Now, we're coming off career lows in yards per route and yards after catch per reception. His yards after catch was down nearly 2 full yards versus his 2023 career high in that category. The question that we have to answer in deciding whether we're drafting him is, does that mean that we just watched Tyreek Hill take a significant step in declining at his age, or did he just suffer for his quarterback not being in there and he's about to rebound? And I think, Jared, the answer is probably somewhere in between those two things, because we've got some good news and bad news if we break down last year's numbers with and without Tua. The good news, he had 4.2 yards after catch per reception in the games where Tua played, 2.0 in non-Tua games. So obviously much better when the quarterback's in there. That makes sense. The bad news, even if you take that 4.2 and spread it over the full season, that would have tied Tyreek Hill's career low, which was from 2022, which was the last time that he had to miss some time and had to deal with other quarterbacks. That time, however, Tyreek Hill actually had more yards after catch per reception in the non-Tua games than he had in the Tua games. So I think we'll get some rebound. I think we're also getting some decline. And the question then is, how much is the decline this year? And does he still have the upside to pay off from the bottom of wide receiver 1 territory?
He's wide receiver 16 in underdog ADP. He very regularly goes in round 3. I think Tyreek Hill is maybe the most important decision to make in fantasy football this year, because I think you're right, Matt, that the truth is probably somewhere in between what we saw in 2023 and 2024. But man, if you get something close to 2023 in round 3 of your fantasy draft, like that's a league winning pick. I also think the downside is that, like Jalen Waddle emerges as Miami's number 1 wide receiver this year. Achane and Jonnu Smith continue to play big roles, and Tyreek Hill's like a 21% target share guy and not as efficient as he was. And he produces as like a low-end wide receiver 2, maybe even a wide receiver 3. So I think the range of outcomes is wide here. We should also say too that, he played through that wrist injury all of last season. He got hurt in August, played through it, had to have 2 off-season surgeries. So it was obviously a big deal. So I think it's fair to say that played a factor last year as well. At this point in round 3, I'm willing to gamble on Tyreek Hill. I'm not going to take him every time. I don't want to get, overexposed to him, but just we talk all the time, upside trumps everything. Now, again, I think Tyreek Hill still has the upside to be at least a top 5 fantasy receiver this season if he gets back to even 90% of what he was just 2 years ago in 2023. Again, if you get that in round 3 and don't screw up the rest of your draft, your team's going to be really tough to beat.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we have season-defining upside if we get anywhere back close to the 2023 version of Tyreek Hill. I do think he's also going early enough that if he is just an aging receiver who is losing a step this year, which is, especially important for a speed receiver, it's early enough that he could be bad news for your team. I think if you're drafting for volume, you get shares of all of these top-level Dolphins guys. I think if you're making more individual decisions, if you're drafting just a few teams or deciding in one single draft, I think you want to pick a horse to ride in this, somewhere in this offense. If you're scared of Tyreek Hill, I think you should lean toward Jalen Waddle or Devon Achane if you just don't want to trust either of the wide receivers. But I think if you're out on all 3 of those Dolphins, I think that's going to be a mistake.
And I'd still throw Jonnu Smith in there. I know you're not into him, but I think if Miami is forced to deploy the offense they did last year, which was, more quick hitting passes because of the bad O-line, because Tua's injury history, that's what created the big seasons for Achane and especially Jonnu Smith. So I think that is still within the range of possibilities. I think ideally, though, Miami wants to go back to the offense they had the previous couple seasons, where it is more of those intermediate shots to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. And if they do that successfully, then I think Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle can pay off their ADPs right now.
I think it'll be bad news for the Dolphins if Jonnu Smith is anywhere close to what he was last season. And we'll still see if he gets traded. Like that's out there as a possibility, because it appears that Miami does not want to give him the new contract that he's seeking. Just outside our top 12, just outside that tier 3, we've got Ladd McConkey, Rashee Rice, and Mike Evans, all tied with the same 3D value, a top tier 4. A very interesting tier overall, but those 3 guys up top. And Rashee Rice jumps into tier 3 if you switch to PPR. He's a very interesting player this year in a very interesting offense overall. We already talked about Patrick Mahomes on the QB show. Obviously, we've talked about Isaiah Pacheco plenty, and we're actually going to get more into one of Rashee Rice's teammates later in this show. I think, though, Rashee Rice, just very interesting, because the way he started last year, it was like he was going to be one of the season-defining players. And now we have to see if, that was just a small sample that we can't really project forward, if things are a lot different when we get, Xavier Worthy with a year of NFL play under his belt, plus a healthy Hollywood Brown, plus a skinnier Travis Kelce, could all be different. Very interesting offense overall, and Rice is an interesting player, I think.
For sure. And, really, it seems like the knee is not going to be an issue. It seems like a suspension is unlikely to come this season. So those were like the big questions we had about Rashee Rice. Not that they're totally off the table now, but I do feel pretty comfortable that he's going to be healthy and eligible for week 1. But, it was the 3 games last year for Rashee Rice. And it was 8 or 9 games in 2023 where he was dominant. So it is like a decent sample size now of him being super productive, but he runs routes in the same area of the field as Travis Kelce, and he runs routes in the same area of the field as Xavier Worthy was late last season when Worthy actually started producing. So just how the Chiefs are going to deploy all 3 of those guys, and will Rashee Rice still get the type of volume he was getting early last season? That's the big question. Now, in a round 3 price tag, he doesn't have to, right? If he's getting that type of volume, he's like a borderline round 1 pick. So I like him as long as he's in round 3. If he starts to creep into the middle of round 2, then it'll be more of a question.
Yeah, you can read the full Rashee Rice profile in my Chiefs team preview on draftsharks.com right now, along with all the teammates that we both alluded to and talked about directly. I wish that I had drafted more Rashee Rice earlier in best ball season. And he's a good example of just kind of the general thing of drafting for what could be, as opposed to making assumptions that are too strong. And I'm trying to learn this lesson every year. And I feel like every year there's somebody that I fail to learn it on. There are other examples where I think I've done better, but this is one where I should have earlier in the offseason looked more at the possibility of what if he doesn't get suspended at all this year. And if we get a full season of Rashee Rice and he's going, mid to late round 4, maybe even gotten to round 5 a number of times. I finally got around to that a bit before, the whole draft market got more onto, hey, he might not get suspended at all this year. And now that's driven his price up into round 3. But it's one of those lessons that I'm trying to drill home for myself going forward. And, I think it is more widely applicable than just the Rice situation.
Yep, sure. Especially in these big basketball tournaments when ceiling is, more than half the battle. Again, though, I do still think Rice is a good value now. So I don't think you totally missed the boat if you hadn't been drafting a bunch of them. I could see him getting into round 2 by July or August.
I agree. And if he does get used the way that he did at the beginning of last season, then he could wind up looking like a round 1 pick by the end of the season. Wide receiver targets now in our drafting, Jared. Why don't you hit me with somebody that you're targeting at the position?
I'll start with the guy you mentioned in that tier with Rashee Rice and Ladd McConkey, and it's Mike Evans, who, we have Rashee Rice going round 3. Ladd McConkey goes round 2 in pretty much every draft at this point. Mike Evans is a round 4 pick by ADP. He's like the Alvin Kamara or the James Conner of wide receivers at this point. The guy that, people just think is too old. He's going to fall off the cliff, but it doesn't happen. It will eventually, but I'm going to keep, reaping the rewards of people being scared to draft Mike Evans. Career high in yards per route run last year. Career high. This is a guy who's had a Hall of Fame career, so no signs of decline. Finished wide receiver 8 last year in half PPR points per game. Again, he's going wide receiver 20 in ADP, so 12 spots lower than where he finished last year. He has now been a top 15 wide receiver in half PPR points per game in 7 straight seasons. If he's going wide receiver 20, I'm going to take my chances that this isn't the year he falls off the cliff. Again, there's been no signs of decline from Mike Evans.
He's especially nice to see at that ADP when you're sitting in round 2 and you're like, do I take a running back or a wide receiver here? Is there going to be wide receiver value for me next turn? Then you're like, oh, everybody's letting Mike Evans fall a little too far. I'll go ahead and take this running back. And then I got Mike Evans next turn. In a similar range, DJ Moore remains a target for me. Wide receiver 23 in underdog ADP right now, wide receiver 22 in our rankings. I think we're even low with that ranking for him. I think that's much closer to his floor than his ceiling this year. DJ Moore's first 2 seasons in Chicago, wide receiver 7 and wide receiver 16 in half PPR. That first season, of course, came with Justin Fields as his quarterback. Last year came with Rome Odunze joining the team, with Keenan Allen joining the team, and with the rookie quarterback that didn't play all that well. So we've already got 2 top 16 fantasy seasons for DJ Moore in Chicago. This should be a much better situation for passing points, for passing production than either of those first 2 seasons. That certainly doesn't mean that DJ Moore matches the target share from that wide receiver 1 level year with Justin Fields, but it sets him up with multiple paths to success. And I think the concern, the reason that people have him lower on the board is, oh, but they added Colston Loveland, they added Luther Bird, and there are these new guys. What if those guys take targets away? What if they don't, is the question that you should be asking, because DJ Moore does not belong at the bottom of wide receiver 2 territory. When you're trying to figure out an offense like that, you should start by expecting the guy that has already showed us over a bunch of years across 2 teams with not very good quarterback play that he's productive and good at football. Start by expecting that guy to stay good and stay productive, and then figure out everybody else behind that.
Yeah, I was drafting DJ Moore hot and heavy for the first couple months of draft season. I've backed off a bit just with the additions, and I just kind of want to. Again, I've talked about just. There's, I think, a wide range of outcomes for what this Bears offense is going to look like this season under the brand new coaching staff. But if we get, some good buzz on DJ Moore, and I will say there were concerns with Moore's 2024 beyond the fact that the Bears offense was crappy. His numbers, his efficiency stuff and PFF grade was down. I know there were some effort concerns from DJ Moore as well. So there are some concerns, but I do like the price. I do think he could be a top 12 fantasy wide receiver. He's been a strong target earner across multiple teams with multiple quarterbacks, and I do think that matters. That speaks well of the wide receiver, not just his surroundings. I do think Moore is a strong target earner. If 2024 proves to be the fluke of his career, he's going to end up being a strong value this year.
It's like a Plinko board where I'm going to watch all you guys bounce around those concerns, and then I'm going to stand at the bottom of the board and catch that Plinko chip in the $10,000 space. So who's your next wide receiver target?
Yeah, I have Jalen Waddle, who we talked about previously. He's at wide receiver 31 in ADP, and I started the draft season kind of out on Waddle because I think just because he burned me so bad last year. Like, I had a ton of Jalen Waddle heading into last season. He was horrible. I mean, he was wide receiver 60 in half PPR points per game. That still sounds crazy to say. Like, I didn't think that was within his range of outcomes last year. Volume and efficiency way down for Jalen Waddle last year. You look at his overall resume, 6th overall pick of his draft. He's just 26 years old, 104 catches as a rookie, wide receiver 13 in half PPR in his second season, wide receiver 22 in year 3. So last year just looks like the aberration. And I think he's just a good bounce back bet. Regardless of how it happens, I think that he has multiple paths to bounce back as well. I mean, again, if Tyreek Hill is actually cooked, I think that's excellent news for Jalen Waddle. If Jonnu Smith gets traded or just goes back to being the old Jonnu Smith, the 14% target share guy, that's good for Jalen Waddle. So at wide receiver 31, there are multiple ways that Jalen Waddle can pretty easily beat that price tag.
Fantasy analysis can be so complicated at this point. With Jalen Waddle, it's simple. I think that you either think he's not that good or you think he has really big rebound potential this year. And I think you have to think one of those 2 things about him. I'm not going to tell you have to draft him, but if you're making decisions on Jalen Waddle, those are the 2 options. And if you don't think that he's not very good, then you should be at least getting some Jalen Waddle, because like you said, there are multiple ways this can change. And I guarantee you that by the end of last season, Mike McDaniel was like, what the hell did we do with Jalen Waddle last year? This guy is young, fast, and really good. and we barely used him. We threw too many passes at Jonnu Smith. We've got to change this. So get some Jalen Waddle. Jaden Reed is a bit more of a best ball specific one for me. I think at the least he's a high ceiling weekly play who's now going in mid to late wide receiver 4 range. Last year, that ranged all the way from low wide receiver 2 to low wide receiver 3 range. I've mentioned him before, so I won't get too far into it, but I just think he's an upside play in this spread it around wide receiver core. I think he's going to get frustrating on a lineup setting team, but I'm getting some shares, especially because where he's going, if I take a couple of early running backs and I get to that point of my draft with either 3 or 4 wideouts, he makes a great fit as my 4th or 5th wide receiver who's just going to give me some spike weeks. And I don't really care if he doesn't get any more in the way of target share. Plus, he's a good way for me to make the bet that I've mentioned multiple times that I'm just betting the Green Bay passing game is going to be a lot better and more productive this year than it was last season.
Yeah, and if I'm drafting Jaden Reed, I am heavily targeting Jordan Love on that team. So I think it's just a bet on the Packers throwing more. That's what Jaden Reed needs. We know what his role is at this point, right? He's not going to play in 2 wide receiver stats. He's a slot only guy that hurts him a little bit, but we also know he's just a good player and he's going to be efficient. So if he gets the passing volume rebound back to what the Packers did in 2023, I think Reed is at that point would be a good bet to beat ADP.
Any more targets for you?
Yeah, let me mention the Saints wide receivers one more time. I know I've talked about them and this offense quite a bit already this offseason, but I mean, Chris Olave is wide receiver 37 in ADP. I mean, you don't get a chance, I don't think, to get a player that talented at wide receiver 37 very often. There's obviously concerns. He has the 5 concussions. He has quarterback issues, but just a talented wide receiver who I think should still be the target leader on this team. And then I do think the Saints offense, I'm not saying it's going to be good or even like a league average offense, but I think a lot of people expect it to be like the worst or a bottom 3 offense. I just think there's enough talent at the skill positions, and I think Kellen Moore is a good enough offensive play caller that the Saints aren't going to be a disaster. And I think if that's the case, Chris Olave smashes his ADP. And then Rashid Shaheed as well, wide receiver 56, another case of, I think, a guy who missed most of last season with an injury. And he's just, people have concerns about this offense and the quarterback play. But Rashid Shaheed was scoring as a top 25 wide receiver before he went down last year. He's being drafted as wide receiver 56. And if we're talking best ball, like he has that best ball profile where a lot of his work is down the field. So he's an even better pick now in best ball than he will be when we get to more lineup setting drafts.
I think Chris Olave and Jalen Waddle are very, very similar in that it's totally fair if you're like, that guy burned me last year, I don't want to draft him this year. But you've got to pay attention to the fact that he's going like 20 plus spots later in positional ADP. And anytime a guy is like that, you have to ask yourself, does he really just stink? Or should I go ahead and target him now for the same reasons I targeted him a year ago, now that I have to pay a whole lot less and the risk level is a ton lower? Josh Downs is one more guy that's very high in my player exposures, and you will also find him in my breakouts article right now. You can read the full case there, but here's a simplified version, Jared. First of all, we could just look at the fact that Josh Downs finished 31st in PPR points per game last year, 33rd in half PPR points per game, and now he's going wide receiver 45 on Drafters, which is full PPR. He's wide receiver 48 on Underdog. We could just end the case right there. The guy's heading into his 3rd season. He turns 24 in August. So unless you think that he sucks and got lucky last year, there's no reason not to draft him. Now, the reason to draft him is because there's still plenty of upside beyond what he has showed us so far. He was better last year than Michael Pittman in expected PPR points per game, expected touchdowns, in yards per route. He ranked 10th among all wide receivers in that success per route metric that I mentioned from Matt Harmon earlier in this show. And then Daniel Jones, he's not somebody that's going to boost anybody like any wide receiver to a much higher level, but Daniel Jones has been good for short range receivers in his career. He throws short passes. Josh Downs is the shorter range of the primary 2 Indianapolis wide receivers, and anything is better than what Anthony Richardson gave them last year. So a full season of something better than 2024 Anthony Richardson is guaranteed to be a positive for Josh Downs.
Yeah, Josh Downs is just really good. I mean, you look at his target earning last year, his per route efficiency, just really top end stuff, like top 10 in the NFL among wide receivers kind of stuff from Josh Downs. The quarterback play almost has to be better this year. And really every day there's like something from the Colts coaching staff or the Colts media that makes it sound like Daniel Jones at this point is the favorite to be under center come week 1. We probably still see Richardson at some point. I just think the quarterback situation is going to be better for Josh Downs. And I think he's way too cheap. He's also one of my highest drafted wide receivers right now.
And I think the buzz is going to start piling up on Josh Downs where he could move up the ADP board. So if you're drafting right now, I would make sure to get some right now before that happens. Wide receiver fades. Who are you not drafting?
I'm going to start with Marvin Harrison Jr., who is wide receiver 15 in underdog ADP. He finished wide receiver 41 last year. So I'm expecting him to take a second year jump and be better, be more productive. But man, drafters are expecting a huge jump, like 25 spots up the wide receiver standings. First of all, nothing's changed in Arizona. It's the same coaching staff, the same quarterback, the same target competition. So you can't point to anything there helping Marvin Harrison. And then if you look at the metrics, he was just kind of so last year. So among 116 qualifying wide receivers, 55th in yards per route. He was 29th in PFF receiving grade, but 87th in ESPN receiver score. And he didn't pass the eye test for me. Like, I never watched a Cardinals game last year and thought that Marvin Harrison looked like this top 5, overall pick, this, future stud wide receiver. Now again, that can all change. I know there's been lots of positive buzz on him this offseason, but I mean, a lot is going to have to change from last year for him to pay off his cost where it is right now.
I think we're all expecting a big step forward. I think he's getting drafted at a range where he could finish the end of this season. The target share was good last year. The air yard share was really good. He was top 6 at the position in that category. I certainly think that he's capable of a much bigger season with nothing changing, except he's got a year of experience. His quarterback is still a little bit iffy. The offense is kind of, we'll see. I wish that Marvin Harrison were going later so I could be in on him, but I agree. He's not a draft target for me and much closer to a fade. In a similar range, Terry McLaurin, wide receiver 17. We've talked about it, so we don't have to get too far into it, but he's never been a target share maven, loaded up on touchdown fortune last year. And now Deebo Samuel is there with easily the biggest target challenge that McLaurin has faced to this point. So, whatever version of Deebo we get here, there's that involved. So I think you either have to expect McLaurin to somehow get more target share with that added challenge this year, or again, get very lucky on touchdowns. And neither of those is a very good bet at the price that you're paying. Jackson Smith-Njigba is going right behind him and has been similar for me where I just don't click it very often. I'm a little bit more wary though of passing on JSN up there because it's not an exciting pass offense, and that makes it easier to pass on him. But the fact that it's unexciting and that there aren't a whole lot of other proven or still not as old as Cooper Kupp options there, that could make JSN their Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I'm a little bit worried if by passing on JSN that I miss on somebody who does just get 160 targets this year and is a top 12er just based on volume. So I'm forcing him into lineups onto my best ball teams a bit more, quite a bit more actually than I am Terry McLaurin, but still a little wary of his draft cost.
Yeah, and his cost is down. He was wide receiver 14 in ADP in May, and now he's down to wide receiver 18, which is getting closer to where we have him ranked. We have him wide receiver 23 in half PPR. This is a format thing for me. I'm going to get my JSN on Drafters or other full PPR sites. I do think JSN takes a value hit on underdog where it's half PPR. I still have concern. I think there's a chance. I think he's a good bet to see a target share in like the mid 20s, and there's a chance he gets in the high 20s because I think Cooper Kupp might be washed and there's not much else there. But I still have concerns with the play calling. I think they're going to go a lot run heavier than they did last year. And I just have concerns about Sam Darnold turning back into old Sam Darnold, especially what's behind a bad offensive line in Seattle. That's kind of been Darnold's bugaboo. So those are my concerns with JSN. That's why I still have him as a shy away guy at this point, not a full fade. And again, I'd much rather take him on a full PPR site.
I agree with that. And I think he's also going to be better in lineup setting than best ball, because I think he's going to be a better bet for weekly floor than he's going to be for weekly spikes. Any more fades for you?
That's it for me.
I'm going to go with Xavier Worthy, who I've talked about. Let's start with just the guys around Xavier Worthy in underdog ADP. We've got Ted McMillan, Xavier Worthy, DJ Moore, Jameson Williams, DK Metcalf, Travis Hunter, Devontae Smith, Cortland Sutton, George Pickens, Zay Flowers, all within a round. And to me, Worthy stands out among that group as a guy with the lowest target floor, who we still don't know exactly how it's going to work out with him. Like you mentioned earlier, Jared, when he finally got productive late in the year, it was because they started throwing him short stuff because the deep stuff was not working. Now, I expect the deep stuff to work better in year 2 because he's got Patrick Mahomes as his quarterback. And I mean, that combo should find more deep success, but they've also got Rashee Rice back. They've got a healthy Hollywood Brown. They've got, a slimmer Travis Kelce who might be more effective than he was last year. So it just, all of that challenges the target share. And I certainly think Worthy is in a spot and good enough to outperform his expected level of production, but he's also surrounded by guys who have similar upside on, like a per opportunity basis, but also much better paths to consistent targets. So I'm passing on him, and I'm especially passing on him because I can wait another 8 rounds and take Hollywood Brown. And I'm not saying that those two are going to finish close to each other in the final fantasy rankings. I think that is within the range of outcomes, but I think the ADP gap is way too wide between them because the way that they score fantasy points to this point has looked pretty similar. I think it will look pretty similar this year. And I don't know what the target share is for either guy. So when I'm facing that single really big unknown, I'd much rather wait until much later and take the guy that's going 8 rounds after Brown in round 4 and spread my shares around to those other wideouts that I mentioned.
I say take Xavier Worthy and Marquise Brown. I'm definitely not going to poo-poo Marquise Brown because I think he's a strong value in draft, and I still think he's a good bet to be, at least that number 3 wide receiver for the Chiefs. And I get the concerns with the Worthy. Like, we could be sitting here in 8 months and, Worthy was a 17% target share guy for the Chiefs. And if that's the case, it's going to be basically impossible for him to pay off ADP. But for me, I don't know what it's going to look like exactly, but I don't want to be betting against a, first round wide receiver heading into his second year with Patrick Mahomes, who really flashed, really played well late in his rookie year. I think that's a guy who could definitely, and he's going wide receiver 22, which still surprises me just because I think a lot of times these first round wide receiver, young, exciting player heading into year 2 on the Chiefs, coming off a big close to the season, I'm surprised he's not going earlier. So I think wide receiver 22 is a fine price to pay for Xavier Worthy.
He was in the teens earlier in the offseason. I think he's been pushed down a bit since then, but I still think he's going too high. And I think that you probably need to either not like Xavier Worthy or not like Rashee Rice at their respective prices, especially if you just look at the Andy Reid history in KC. They have not had wide receivers finish together inside the top 30. They just consistently don't. So it would be betting on something that hasn't happened in the Mahomes, Andy Reid, Kansas City offense. It would be betting against, to me at least, Rashee Rice being something close to what he has been when on the field over the past 2 years. And it would also be taking Worthy over all those guys that are in that range. So for all those reasons, I say no, Xavier Worthy.
Well, I mean, the reason the Chiefs haven't had 2 top 30 wide receivers is because of Travis Kelce, right? Like he's been their top target or their 1B for all that time. So I think Worthy and Rice can pay off if Kelce really hits the wall this season and gets 15% of the team's targets. In that case, I think there'd be enough room for both those guys to hit.
Yeah. So that's a good point for just kind of figuring out how all of those things fit together. Cause I don't think that you can be in on all of those guys at cost. I want to just throw out a few names that I'm not drafting later in the draft because we tend to focus on higher profile players. Rashad Bateman, Marvin Mims, Jack Besh, all guys that I'm actually fading at their later ADPs. I mean, Rashad Bateman just got pretty lucky on touchdowns last year. Does not do well on target share. I think he has more attractive guys around him. Marvin Mims, very similar. Jack Besh, I like the player, but I have a hard time seeing him being an effective fantasy point scorer this year with Brock Bowers, with Jacoby Myers in his way. And he had an up and down college career where we don't really know yet what kind of prospect we're getting. And I throw those out because I think it's important to spread your best ball shares around to build out the portfolio. But I also think once you get into those later rounds, it's really a better time to zero in on the guys that you really like and build up your shares of that player in that range, because that's where you can actually find the true breakout players, the guys who have something that you can bet on that, dramatically outperforms their draft position.
And those 2 guys are all going in the same range as Rashid Shaheed and Keon Coleman, who are my 2 easily most roster wide receivers in that range of drafts. I think Bateman's okay in best ball just because of his profile. I won't be touching him in lineup setting leagues. I'm not touching Marvin Mims at cost. I'm not touching Jack Besh at cost. He's actually been running with the second team behind Dante Thornton. And I know it's only June. We'll see how it shakes out, but there's at least a chance the Raiders view Besh as the Jacoby Myers replacement. Myers going to hit free agency next offseason. So I'm out on him. And Dante Thornton's someone I've been taking with my last pick in best ball drafts because he is that best ball archetype, that speed receiver who could, pop for 2 big games this season. If he does that, he paid off.
And this is the range for me, Jared, that we always get the question of who's the guy you got to have in every draft, especially as we get to July and August. People always name early draft guys, but this is the real range where the guys live that you got to have, because this is where the sleepers are. And really that's the primary reason that we do the ceiling projections. It's why we activate that upside mode in the second half in your draft war room. As we get into lineup setting season, I think this is where you hone in on the real difference makers like Josh Downs that I was talking about earlier.
Yep, for sure.
You can find our previous episodes covering the running back rankings and the quarterback rankings on the Draft Sharks YouTube channel or your favorite audio podcast listening platform. Next up, tight ends this Friday. We've got IDP rankings next week. July is going to begin with a dynasty startup mock draft, and then our highly anticipated return to the team preview series. Make sure you subscribe or follow the show now so that you don't miss any of that vital draft prep material. All of it, of course, targeted to make Draft Sharks your unfair advantage.